The 14th century is one of the worst centuries of church history, really. Many problems which were never going to be solved first really fully reared their ugly heads in the 14th century. As we mentioned when we were talking about the 13th century, the papacy had begun to decline into a kind of rather self-serving bureaucracy. Again, it continued to perform its doctrinal functions, and again, those are the only ones which are guaranteed by God, not its moral rectitude. Obviously, in order to discharge its duties as the leaders of Christendom, it had turned into an extremely large bureaucracy, and the abuse of prelates holding multiple dioceses at the same time and other benefices had become pretty endemic and is sort of essential for the management of the Roman Curia. So it was very hard for the papacy to fix abuses and corruption in the church when, as an institution, it was becoming dependent upon them. The long battle between the Hohenstaufen dynasty, the most extreme example of which was the Emperor Frederick II, who crowned himself King of Jerusalem in the Holy Sepulchre while excommunicate back in the 13th century. That battle became so intense that the papacy did ultimately prevail, but it kind of humbled and weakened the office of Holy Roman Emperor. And the result of that was that the universalist forces in Christendom became broken and weakened, and the national monarchies became much more powerful. Now, that might seem like a good thing to the popes at certain points, but long term it wasn't, because the universal elements in Christendom relied on papal approval and consecration for their legitimacy, and therefore they could never turn against Christendom institutionally, whereas the national monarchies relied for their identity and their position on the nations that they were the monarchies of, and therefore they were potentially independent of the church and therefore capable of turning on the church. The first really terrible sign of this came with the conflict between King Philip IV of France and Pope Boniface VIII. Boniface was keen to raise taxes from the French clergy. This wasn't something he was entitled to do by his own authority, because the clergy was seen as an immune, quasi-diplomatic caste subject to an independent sovereign power, that of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Of course, a number of kings over the course of medieval history had chafed at this and wanted to subject them financially and legally to their authority. And this was easier to do because of the declining prestige of the papacy and because of the weakening of the universal forces within Christendom. So the attempt to do this led to a bitter conflict between the Pope Boniface VIII and the French King Philip IV. Eventually, Boniface tried to summon a council in order to presumably condemn the errors implied by the King Francis' actions and to condemn him in person. Boniface VIII attempted to prevent this, Philip IV attempted to prevent this by preventing the bishops north of the Alps from getting to Italy in order to attend the council which Boniface VIII intended to hold. In his fury about this act of sabotage, Boniface VIII issued a very famous papal document. It's very short, it's easy to read, it's just a page long. It's called Unam Sanctam. And in that document, which is an infallible act of the papal magisterium, he lays out the essential understanding of the organization of Christendom, which had developed since the coronation of Charlemagne and more intensely since the rise of the Gregorian Reform movement. So if you want to understand the view of the relationship between the temporal and the spiritual power that was developed by the papacy in the High Middle Ages, you can't do much better than going and reading that document, Unam Sanctam. It famously begins resoundingly, urged by faith, we are obliged to believe and to profess that the Church is one, holy, Catholic and apostolic. We believe in her with sincerity and confess with simplicity that outside of her there is neither salvation nor the forgiveness of sins. And Boniface goes on to compare the church to Noah's Ark. And of course, everybody outside Noah's Ark was destroyed. He then elaborates on the episode at the Last Supper where the apostles show our Lord that they are in possession of two swords, and our Lord says, "It is enough." And Boniface explains, basing himself on the teaching of St. Bernard and some earlier writers, that these two swords represent the spiritual power of the church's hierarchy and the temporal power of the temporal rulers, the kings and emperors who rule in Christendom, but that both of these ultimately belong to the Pope because they both belong to the apostles under the leadership of Peter. And he ends the bull by saying, furthermore, we declare, we define, we proclaim that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. So he isn't holding anything back. Philip IV was furious and sent soldiers to attack the Pope in the town of Anini, where he was hiding at the time. And the Pope was physically assaulted and beaten up by the French soldiers and was so shocked at his treatment that he died apparently of shock just a week or so later. So this was a real low point in the history of the papacy. It kind of represents the assault on the Pope at Anini, really represents the end of the great era of reform and papal monarchy that began with the election of Pope Leo IX back in the 11th century. Boniface VIII was succeeded by a Dominican Pope who was a perfectly good chap, but in fact only lived for a brief time. And then the cardinals, perhaps having lost their nerve in the face of French pressure, elected the Archbishop of Bordeaux in southwest France as the next pope, and he took the name Clement V. He wasn't actually present for the conclave, he was still in France, and in the end he would never come to Italy. He stayed in France for his entire reign, and 2 years later moved to the city of Avignon. Avignon was technically not part of the Kingdom of France, but part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it was French-speaking and geographically in France. So the election of Clement V represents the beginning of a very bleak period in the history of the Church known as the Avignon Papacy, in which 7 successive popes would refuse to come to Italy and would stay in France in the city of Avignon, causing great scandal throughout the Church and beginning to create a certain degree of resistance to the papacy in England, which had hitherto been the most loyal of all kingdoms to the papacy because it had been evangelized by the initiative of Pope Gregory the Great all the way back in the 6th century. So the Avignon Papacy is just one of many calamities which occurred in the Church in the course of the 14th century. The whole of Western Christendom was blighted by the Black Death, probably a re-emergence of the same sort of plague as devastated the Roman Empire in the reign of Justinian. It killed a very large proportion of the population of Western Europe and caused great cultural dislocation. Also in the 14th century, a dispute arose because of the extinction of the direct Capetian line in the Kingdom of France, the dynasty that had ruled it since the time of Hugh Capet in 987. This led to a dispute between the King of England, Edward III, and the Counts of Valois. According to one way of calculating the succession to the French throne, the Counts of Valois would become the new kings of France, but according to a rival way of calculating it, the King of England, through his mother, would become the rightful King of France. And this led to the 100 Years' War, which was actually a series of 4 different wars over a space of about 120 years, but it had a devastating impact on both kingdoms and further damaged Western Christendom and doomed any hopes of reviving the crusading effort. In the pontificate of Clement V, the Ecumenical Council of Vienne was held. Vienne is in France. It was the Council of Vienne defined a number of important dogmas, one being that the intellectual soul is the form of the human body, which is a very important philosophical and theological principle of Christian anthropology. So denying the idea of the soul as a sort of independent substance that is only accidentally connected to the body. The other important definition was in the moral order, the definition of the immorality of usury, that it's a mortal sin to commit usury. It was defined that it was a heresy to deny this. But the real purpose of the council, unfortunately, was to dissolve the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar were one of the two most prestigious of the military religious orders, essentially warrior monks, which had been founded to assist with the Crusades. They were the sort of special forces of the crusading era. There were quite a few of them, but the two most famous were the Templars, the poor knights of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, and the Hospitallers, the knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. There were quite a lot of rivalry between the two of them, but the Templars were the most prestigious. In the course of their history, they developed a complicated system of banking to facilitate the travel of crusaders and other pilgrims to the Holy Land, where one could deposit one's money with a Templar house somewhere in Western Europe, and then be given a document which, when one presented at a Templar house in the Holy Land, would allow one to withdraw the same amount of money there, minus a service charge. This had developed into a way of lending money now that there were no Templar houses in the Holy Land. And the King of France, our friend Philip IV, had ended up becoming quite indebted to the Templars, and they had declined in popularity since the conspicuous failure of the crusading movement in recent decades. And so Philip IV weaponized this to accuse the Templars of a number of heresies and depravities, and have them all brutally executed and the Templar order suppressed, thereby freeing himself from all of his debts. It's almost universally believed among modern historians that the Templars were completely innocent of the allegations made against them, and no tribunal that investigated them outside of France came to the conclusion that they were guilty. So, and the confessions which the French authorities were able to extract were extracted under severe torture, and were retracted by the leaders of the Templars before their executions. So it's a particularly depressing episode in the history of the Church, though the Council of Vienne never actually formally stated that the Templars were guilty, and a document was discovered more recently in which Clement V recorded for posterity that he didn't believe the charges, but he was bullied into not preventing Philip IV from the bloody dissolution of the Templars, which he pursued. In the course of the Avignon Papacy, a great Italian poet and cultural figure, Petrarch, whose life was almost completely enclosed within the Avignon Papacy, he began to lead or initiate a kind of revolt against medieval civilization, basically through a greater ability to master the very sophisticated and mannered Latin of the high classical period, the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, the golden age of Latin, as scholars have considered it. They began to be contemptuous of the much more sort of workaday Latin which had prevailed since the time of St. Jerome up until the end of the 13th century. And even to describe the Middle Ages, the fact the term the Middle Ages comes out of this movement, they began to describe it as the Dark Ages, because it was so primitive linguistically, they believed, compared to the pagan period of ancient Rome. This was a disaster, really, culturally, because the great self-confidence of medieval civilization, which was developing these glorious Gothic cathedrals and the scholastic method, and developing the universities as institutions, perfecting the philosophy of the ancient world, refining theological reasoning, and developing these new governmental structures of parliament and limited government and checks and balances. All these things, which are such great achievements of medieval civilization, began to be eclipsed by a kind of fad for pagan antiquity, really just based on a kind of literary snobbery. But really this is an effect of the huge cultural collapse initiated by the delinquent behaviour of the papacy in going off to Avignon for 70 years, and in the impact of the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. At the same time, the rivalry between the Franciscans and the Dominicans, particularly that branch of the Franciscans which was engaging in intellectual academic pursuits rather than the kind of penitential preaching that St. Francis had envisaged, had led to the development of a movement of philosophy that was opposed to the intellectual work of Thomas Aquinas, because he was a Dominican, and therefore also to the entire Socratic tradition going back to the 3rd and 4th century BC, which developed out of the great philosophers Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And this movement was called nominalism because it denied the real existence of common natures within created things and claimed that these were mere names. And this is basically a revival of Sophism, the great philosophical enemy of Socrates, and therefore a kind of derailing of the entire Western philosophical project, and it would become catastrophic, a kind of cancer growing within the intellectual tradition of the West, which would eventually shatter its unity in the 16th century. And the leader of this movement was a Franciscan friar from England called William of Ockham. He was known as the Venerable Inceptor because the masters of Oxford University were rather suspicious of his doctrinal positions and refused to grant him the degree of master. The suspicions surrounding his ideas led to him being summoned to the papal court in Avignon, where there was already a dispute going on between the Franciscans and the Pope over the nature of our Lord's poverty. These two disputes became entangled, and Ockham and the Minister General of the Franciscans fled from Avignon and pledged themselves to the service of the Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV, who was quarrelling with the Pope over traditional issues of the relative power of popes and emperors. Louis IV belonged to the Wittelsbach dynasty, which eventually ruled Bavaria, not to the Habsburg dynasty, which was briefly eclipsed during this period before returning to the possession of the imperial title later in the 15th century. Because the papacy was weakened by its time in Avignon, it wasn't able to stamp out nominalism or formally condemn it. And so by the end of the Middle Ages, the Via Moderna, the modern way, as nominalism was called, dominated many of the universities of Europe, and in many others was fighting toe-to-toe with the Via Antiqua, the traditional Socratic Aristotelian tradition, which was represented by St. Thomas Aquinas and the other great 13th century doctors of the church. And this would end up doing a great deal of damage to Christendom and probably ultimately securing its demise. At the very end of the 14th century, there occurred a very important union between Poland and Lithuania. Lithuania was the last pagan polity in Europe, and the Polish dynasty, the Piast dynasty, came to an end with Saint Jadwiga of Poland, and Saint Jadwiga was made an offer by the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jagiełło, who offered to convert to Christianity along with his entire people if she would marry him, thereby uniting the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland, ultimately turning them into the largest state in Western Europe. It happened that there was a military religious order that actually ruled in the northern part of the Baltic region, well, the southern shore of the Baltic, called the Teutonic Knights, the Knights of the Hospital of St. Mary of the Teutons of Jerusalem. But despite that name, their main military activity was in the Baltic against the remaining pagan tribes in that region. They were very opposed to the conversion of Jagiełło, rather corruptly, because it prevented them from any further conquests, because they were only licensed to fight against pagan tribes, not against Christian dominions. And so this triggered a war between Jagiełło, now also King of Poland, as well as Grand Duke of Lithuania, and the Teutonic Knights, which would end in the year 1410 with the triumph of Jagiełło and the Poles and the Lithuanians over the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Grunwald. This battle was very important in establishing the principle, at least among Catholic theologians, that it's not morally licit to attack a pagan territory and steal its land and take over the government of that territory simply because it's pagan, because that would be a form of semi-covert, forcible conversion of its population, which is forbidden. Another important development at the end of the 14th century was the end of the Avignon Papacy. The popes had been berated by, most famously, St. Bridget of Sweden and St. Catherine of Siena for living in France instead of in their own proper diocese. And of course, this is an important point in general for Catholics to understand, that the prudential decisions of popes, as distinct from their doctrinal definitions, are entirely capable of being incorrect and even scandalous or sinful for a protracted period of time, because of course the Avignon Papacy took place for 70 years. So the popes failed to be resident in their own diocese for 70 years. And so again, like the immoral behavior of the 10th century popes, that helps to remind us where there is providential protection for the papacy and where there isn't. Eventually, Pope Gregory XI was persuaded by St. Catherine of Siena to return to Rome, but shortly after that he died. And this led to a papal election in Rome itself for the first time in 7 decades. But all the cardinals, or almost all of them, were actually French, not Italian, and they didn't really want to stay in Rome. But the Italians were furious, of course, about having been abandoned by their own primate for all these decades. So while the cardinals were gathered trying to decide who to elect, the Roman people gathered outside the conclave and shouted again and again and again, "Elect a Roman or die." So the cardinals decided that perhaps electing a Frenchman wouldn't be very healthy, and they elected an Italian. He wasn't actually a Roman, but he was Italian, and Pope Urban VI. And Urban, while receiving the homage of the other cardinals and being received and accepted by them as the legitimate pope, nevertheless decided that the French cardinals had essentially kidnapped the institution of the papacy for 70 years, and it became clear within a few months that he was going to have nothing to do with them and that he was going to only appoint Italian cardinals from now on. The French cardinals therefore decided to deny the legitimacy of his election to elect a rival French pope, Pope Clement VII, and to return to Avignon. This led to the Great Western Schism, with 2 different lines of popes, one in Avignon and one in Rome. This was a cause of even greater scandal to the West than the Avignon Papacy itself, and a bungled attempt to resolve the problem by having some cardinals from both camps getting together and electing their own pope in Pisa simply led to 3 different camps and 3 different popes. So by the end of the 14th century, we have 3 different popes. The population of Europe has been devastated by the Black Death. The intellectual life of Europe has been corrupted by the Via Moderna, and the kingdoms of England and France seem to be locked in an interminable war with bloody consequences for both populations. So, as I said, the 14th century is not a happy tale.